Please welcome to the stage our second panel of distinguished speakers, Mr. Viet Ding, Ms. Theane Evangelos, and Ms. Allison Ho.
Welcome for part two. You heard part one, and your colleagues were so superb, and this was so quick that I didn't even have a chance to ask you which terms you clerked for. So let's quickly tell us.
Sure, 2002, 2003.
Wonderful.
And I was OTO 4.
Excellent.
94.
Great. Okay, so we heard about Justice O'Connor's years in the 80s, and you just heard the amazing discussion. 94 was the next decade. Did she have a different approach to the job by 94 than the one you just heard?
I don't think so. I think she pretty much knew how she was going to decide cases. Not every single case, obviously, but rather her judicial craftsmanship didn't change. I think she profoundly believes in constitutional democracy, and by that I mean it is fundamentally the job of a judge not to be the lawgiver, but rather to be the law interpreter. And a large part of that is the difficult task of researching the precedents that come before to make sure that you're consistent with the democratic expectations. You pull it back into the constitutional banks if democratic fervor overflows. But your job is not to disrupt democratic expectations of the constitutional regime, but rather to be the safeguard within which democracy works. I think that basic framework of judicial craftsmanship, I think she established very early on, and she articulates very well throughout her career. And so certainly by the time I was there, which is 13 years in, it was pretty well settled for her.
That's a very interesting way to put it. Not to disrupt democratic expectations, but to enforce the safeguards. I hear you saying she cared about structural restraints, like, of course, famously federalism, but in other cases was generally inclined to defer.
Yeah, I think, you see it best in her speeches. I think the one that struck with me a lot was a speech she gave about Simón Bolívar, the liberator of Latin America, and she talked about how it is the role of the constitutional structure to give the flower to democracy. And she, took on some of the myth regarding Simón Bolívar's revolutionary zeal, but tried to make the case that it was to establish constitutional order. And I think those speeches really bespeaks her philosophy rather than trying to divine little nuggets here and there from opinions, because she is a very cautious and incrementalist jurist. Again, given to the humility of the judge, but in her speeches, she feels more free and articulate her vision.
Wonderful. So by 2000, she's been serving for 2 decades. She's been joined by Justice Ginsburg. We've heard that her approach didn't change, but do you want to give a concrete example of a case and tell us how she approached it, and tell us if you think it was in the same way as your colleagues on the previous panel described?
Sure. I think, well, by then she had a large body of opinions that we could look to and get guidance from. So by that point, it was pretty well established where she was on certain issues. But a case that really stood out to me was the case regarding the 10 Commandments. And that was our term. And the way she approached issues around religion and the Establishment Clause, I think was very telling. When you look back to her upbringing and some of the experiences that she had, she, I think as a young girl, had an experience of being in a church once where, people went around and you had to sort of profess your beliefs in a very open way, and she shared that story, and I think it sort of rubbed her the wrong way. She didn't like the intrusion on personal beliefs, and so I think she was always sort of looking for, how would it make others feel? How would it make that person in the room who maybe had different beliefs feel? and so she would sometimes share her personal experience, not necessarily in the context of talking about the case, but at the time when these cases were being discussed. And I think it was always interesting how she was very mindful of the effect of the court's decisions on different people and whether they would feel included.
That's completely fascinating. And she was famous for the reasonable observer test, which was so quintessential to her jurisprudence, the combination of reasonableness and focusing on its effects on others. Was it introduced in that case?
Well, it was, I should say that I didn't have the pleasure of working on that opinion with her. It was my co-clerk, so I want to be very clear for everyone. But I think it was a really important case, and I saw that she had a good understanding, I think a common understanding with Justice Breyer at that time, and it was interesting to see sort of that relationship and how it had developed, and their the fact that they saw eye to eye on a lot of these issues.
Justice Breyer so appreciated her pragmatism and her willingness to find common ground, and he often said how much he missed her. Allison, were there any cases where they worked together, and can you describe that relationship?
Well, I think what I recall about Justice Breyer was less the cases that they worked on, but as other speakers have talked about, the court can be kind of a cold place, and there's not as much interaction among the justices as you might expect. But I recall Justice Breyer as sort of an exception to that. I recall him coming down to chambers, and they would talk, and so I just recall that them sort of having. I loved what a previous speaker said about Justice O'Connor kind of putting a human face on the court. And I saw in her relationship with Justice Breyer a kind of similar interaction, just two people who enjoyed getting together and talking. Who knows, maybe it was about cases, maybe it was an entirely different subject, but it was just wonderful to see their interaction off the bench as well.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And is there a particular case that you remember that you want to tell us about working on?
I think one I would highlight, and I would springboard off of something that was said in the first panel, and I clerked during the 2002-2003 term when the affirmative action cases were decided, and I think a distinction was made earlier about the justice's approach to sort of the law, but then also from the point of view of society. And I think there was a line, and I won't get it exactly right, in the justice's opinion in Grutter that talked about the importance of paths to opportunity, not just being open, but appearing open. And I think we heard on the first panel and some other things how it was on the one hand, the justice, always said, a wise old man and a wise old woman will come to the same conclusion, but I think she did feel that it was important for the nation to see a court where women sat on the court and participated in it, so that the path to opportunity there wasn't just open, but it appeared to be open, which I think was a central theme in those cases to her.
So powerful. And the theme of women serving together, of course, became quite powerful when Justice Ginsburg joined the court. Yet, I guess you were there the year after Justice Ginsburg joined. What was it like to have the second woman for the first time, and how did they get along at the very beginning?
We talked about this, and she was very clear that she did not mind being the first. As a matter of fact, I thought she thought that it was the time, but she did say that it was pretty lonely the first 10 years, right? And so she very, very much appreciated Justice Ginsburg being there, because of not only the camaraderie, but frankly, to take some of the pressure off of Justice O'Connor. Look a lot has been said about her being first and the like, thanks to Evan's great book title. But she's not great simply because she's first, right? She's first because she's good. She's extraordinarily good, and that fundamental competence came out in her jurisprudence. Consider what would have happened had Governor Babbitt not recommended his primary political challenger to President Reagan, right? She would likely have been running for governor, probably would have won, and then from there may well have been the first vice presidential female candidate, and from there, of course, could have short-circuited the next the female presidential candidate by about a decade at least. And imagine how her greatness would have manifested itself, but for this, right? And so she was always destined to be first, simply because she is that good. And this happens to be the manifestation how she changed history. But I think her effect on American history and the course of human events could have taken a number of ways.
What a powerful and important reminder of that other path she could have taken, and it's striking to think of that other path. By the time you clerked, Justices Ginsburg and O'Connor had been serving for some time. Justice Ginsburg has said frequently that when she joined, Justice O'Connor was the best friend that any justice could have. She so appreciated her thoughtfulness and support and their shared experiences. How was it manifesting itself? And how did Justice O'Connor view and value Justice Ginsburg?
Oh, I think she valued her very much, and I think they both respected one another greatly, and they had a little bit of a competition over who would get out the first opinion.
Oh, they're both pretty fast.
Which was kind of fun.
Wow.
But Justice O'Connor, I think, respected her tremendously, and it was just wonderful for us to be there and to see that.
That's remarkable. Justice Ginsburg says in her In My Own Words book that Justice O'Connor's advice to her was, with Chief Justice Rehnquist, just get the decision out as fast as you can so you don't get a really boring assignment the next time around. But I didn't realize they competed, so I have to ask the obvious follow-up. Who won?
Well, and my co-clerk is sitting in the audience, and I believe we won.
Nice. Well,
Thumbs up.
I'm sure the competition continued year after year, but congratulations to that. That's a tough competition. Any insight on the Justice Ginsburg and Justice O'Connor relationship?
Just to echo what my co-clerks have said, one interesting thing about the year I clerked is that was the year that that court reached a milestone very quietly, and they had been together on the court longer without a personnel change than any other court in modern history. And we, as law clerks, only found out afterwards that they had actually convened a special dinner. And they had all gathered at the court. They had invited Justice Thurgood Marshall's widow to attend and sort of quietly celebrated that milestone. So I think from my perspective, it was a special time because you were sort of there at the end of a court of justices who had, again, been together longer than any other court in modern history.
What a beautiful vision, and that group cohered very well, and all of the justices have talked about how much they missed her when she left. Viet, you haven't given us a specific case from your term. Is there one you want to share to kind of illuminate Justice O'Connor's approach?
Yeah, we had a wealth of riches our term, because we had the Lopez case, we had the term limits case, we had the Chavez-Reno racial gerrymandering case. We had just had a blockbuster of a term.
Wow.
But without going into any specific cases, I do remember that the day after Lopez came out, and the Washington Post had a editorial, the masthead editorial, saying that it was about time that there's a rein-in of congressional power and returning some meaning to Article 1, Section 8 jurisprudence. Larry Tribe, the great constitutional scholar, was quoted in the New York Times saying that this was one step too far. 50 years, there's a first case, but this was one step too far. Congress was essentially daring the court to affirm its structural role. And we brought both to Justice O'Connor, and she says, Larry Tribe and the Washington Post? What did we do wrong? This is before Fred Ryan, by the way, so.
That's an amazing list, and it just reminds us how central her vision was in defining the court. Lopez and federalism, term limits and structural limitations, and of course the gerrymandering cases were all defined by Justice O'Connor's vision, which is why so many called it during her long tenure in the center, the O'Connor Court. What was it like for her to be at the center of the O'Connor Court?
She just did the work. She was so hardworking and focused, and I don't think that she really cared for that. I think she just focused on each case and getting to the right decision in each case. And she was so committed to that, and she was pragmatic, and she was all of these things that we've heard today, but she didn't take herself too seriously at the same time.
Which ties into that wonderful theme of humility that we've heard throughout. Did you have that experience as well, Allison? And that's quite a humility to maintain when you literally are defining the law for the entire country.
Yes, well, I recall a time that one of the previous panelists sort of referred to the justice and just as a cruise director. And it was true, we had a lot of field trips and activities. And I remember one time we'd gone out, we were in a restaurant, and a woman came up to the justice and said, "Has anybody ever told you that you look like?" And the justice said, "Yes, people, I've been told that." And the woman leaned in and said, "Are you her?" And she said, "Pretty much." So, but just her humility and working hard, and I cannot ever repay her for the lessons of quiet confidence, and that there is no circumstance, no challenge, no task that you are not equal to if you're willing to do the work, if you're willing to work hard. And I think her life exemplified that. And I think perhaps as much as the cases that we've talked about, her lasting legacy is really the person that she was and the people that she helped us become as her law clerks.
Wow, what an inspiring life lesson, the quiet confidence that if you work hard enough, you can do whatever you set out to achieve. Viet, what life lessons did you learn from the character and example of Justice O'Connor?
Yeah, let me start by going back before my time with Justice O'Connor, and then we'll take it from there. We're all admittedly the product of our experiences, and Justice O'Connor brought a very special sensibility, if you will, coming as a legislator and a expert practitioner in the art of legislation and politics to the court. She is by no means a disembodied head, but she brings her experiences, her wisdom, and her judgment to that. And that, her influence, therefore, endures to this day. Last year, the big controversy was the decision in Rucho v. the Common Cause, the partisan gerrymandering case, where the court, after, 60 years, finally says that there is no justiciable standard in order to adjudicate a equal protection claim in partisan gerrymandering. And if you read the Chief Justice's opinion, he draws heavily on Justice O'Connor's concurrence in Davis v. Bannemer a good 20, 30 years before. And that was her insight there was driven, almost primarily from her distinctive experience as a legislator and a political practitioner, as opposed to the pure legal jurisprudence. Because once you admit that there is an equal protection claim, then the logical import is that there has to be some sort of approximation to one man, one vote. Some sort of approximation of proportionality. Her opinion says that assumption is upended because not a single state in the 50 states has any system of statewide partisan election. Everything is divided into districts, and so there is no such concept of democratic proportionality within along partisan lines, because our constitutional structure is not designed that way. And yet, if you apply an equal protection purely legalistic lens to it, the measure of one man, one vote, or some sort of proportionality there too is the logical conclusion. But it's just upended by the entire constitutional experience of the political system. That one insight, it seems to me, is an insight that is perfect for Justice O'Connor to come to, and the court ultimately, after 60 years, to adopt. And that is distinctively an illustration not only of her wisdom and judgment, but also of her experience and that understanding of constitutional democracy that I talked about earlier. And so she taught me very straightforwardly, not only through the jurisprudence, but by her example, that you don't run away from your past, you don't run away from your experiences. You make the most out of your experiences and you learn from them. And it's the failure of learning from your experiences and that makes you who you are, is the failure of your upbringing, your failure of your character. And so I think that, more than anything, is the life lesson I take from my time with Justice O'Connor.
Very powerful examples, both of her remarkable influence decades after she came to that conclusion in the gerrymandering case, and of the lesson you took for it about the importance of learning from experience. I'm really eager for your life lessons as well. What did you take from this great woman's example?
Well, I asked Justice O'Connor, it was at the very end of my clerkship, and I asked her, Justice, how did you do it with 3 small children? And we all know your story. We had a nice conversation, and she said, well, I didn't think about it, I just did it. And she said, that's what you need to do, you just do it. Whatever you need to do, you just do it. And she was so firm about that, but I think it reflects what we've heard a lot of today, that she was a doer always and didn't fret over tough decisions or challenges and just took them on one by one. And she always loved everything about life, whether it was going out to see a new art exhibit, or I remember the first time I saw her in Washington, I house sat for her. So I arrived in Washington. I had only met her briefly during my interview, which happened at a Mexican restaurant in a strip mall in Phoenix, by the way.
Wow.
After she picked me up from the airport in Phoenix and took me to lunch. That was where my interview happened. But I arrived at her house in Chevy Chase, and she was a little bit impatient because I was a little late, but I had driven from Boston, so I had an excuse. There was a lot of traffic. And she said, well, we're going to be late for the movies. And I didn't know what movie she had planned, but we went to see a documentary about Mongolia. Huh. And she talked throughout the movie about how she had just been there and what it was like to live in a yurt, and how yak milk was really unpleasant, and she does not recommend ever trying it, but she was talking a lot about the food and the people, and she had this wonderful experience. But she loved to learn from new and different people and to experience everything to the fullest. And at the same time, she had such a balanced approach to everything, and so I think that's just another example of the kind of life she always led and taught us to lead.
That's another amazing example. Have you found that her counsel and modeling of the principle "just do it" has affected you on a daily basis? Have you managed to live up to it?
Absolutely, I try to.
Yeah.
Or now it's just bill it.
Absolutely. I want in our remaining 6 minutes to try to just give us a sense of what made her great. We've heard of her sterling personal characteristics, her discipline, her insistence on just doing it, her humility. We've heard how she applied that on the bench with decisiveness, but a willingness to listen to both sides, and we've heard how that common law approach is unique and missed today. But why did all those qualities manifest themselves in this one remarkable woman?
I guess whole law review articles could be written trying to address that. I do think a lot of her greatness really sprang from her unique upbringing on the ranch. I think her lessons of self-reliance, of no excuses, of hard work, but always within a context of humility and modesty. And when I clerked for her, I also became engaged to my husband. And my parents came to visit, and they shared with the justice how pleased they were that my husband had journeyed down to Texas to talk with them before he proposed to me. And the justice said, well, that's all well and good, but no one talked to me about that. So I got back to my desk, and I called my then fiance, and I said, well, I'm pretty sure she was kidding, but I nonetheless think you need to come down and make an appointment and talk with the, and he did, and we've been married since then. So, but I think I like that story just because I think maybe one aspect that I think comes through today is just her investment in people's lives, and particularly the lives of her law clerks, but so many. I mean, I remember being in chambers. One of the lessons of clerking for Justice O'Connor is if anything, you wanted to be ahead in your work, because you never knew when she would come down and stand by your desk and say, oh, Allison, so-and-so is visiting. They're very interested in the Folger Shakespeare Library. I know you used to study Shakespeare. Would you take so-and-so down and give her a tour of the Shakespeare Library? That was not an unusual occurrence, and I think she loved people, and people loved her. And so being in the chambers with her, seeing that, her curiosity, and again, just her investment in people and the selflessness. It was, I think, a very rare combination of assurance and confidence with humility and selflessness that, to me, is one of the things that made her great.
It's the definition of well-being and of how to lead a good life. It's very inspiring and very well put. Viet, last thoughts about where Justice O'Connor's personal and professional strength and greatness came from?
I think it comes from her backbone, clearly, but let's not be remiss that she had a tower of strength in John O'Connor.
Yes.
John was steadfast. He's always there. He's just, always supportive. Was never jealous of her extraordinary achievements, but rather celebrated all of them. I've never heard a cross word from either of them, and that's a great comfort. As we, I didn't appreciate how important that is when I was 26 years old. Now that we're all in our families and have children, we understand what source of strength that is, and you can't do it alone in this world. And I frankly, she could have done a lot, but I don't think she could have done as much without John, certainly without not having raised a beautiful and successful family that she has, and built up an entire family of clerks and an entire grateful nation without John's support.
Very well said. And thank you for acknowledging John O'Connor's central role. Theana, the last word in this superb discussion is to you. Where did Justice O'Connor's personal and professional greatness come from?
I think from her upbringing, her intellect, her grit, her courage, her humility, and her family. She loved her family, talked about them fondly, and even not just her personal family, but her clerk family. And she talked fondly about her grand clerks and meeting their children, and she wanted to know who you were maybe going to get engaged to. Did she approve of them? But she took a real interest in people, and people loved her for that, and that's part of what made her great.
For further illuminating and bringing to life the personal and professional greatness of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, please thank our panelists.